Talent Ledger, a limited video and podcast series which serves as a companion to the article series of the same name. I am your host, Elise Wilding, principal at M Partners, enabling entrepreneurs and fund founders to move from complexity to action at critical inflection points. Across this series, we're exploring one simple idea. People and work have become the biggest investment line in the business, and too often the least rigorously governed. This series is built around a 4-part article run. If you would like to read the articles, you can access them through the Talent Ledger landing page. There is a link in the first comment. Our series started with what's really happening beneath the noise about hybrid work, a trust recession, a skills mismatch, and AI repricing work. We're now moving into what leaders do about it, how internal comms shifts from broadcast to behavior change, how HR moves from activity to outcomes, and why none of this sticks without executive governance. Each episode is meant to stand alone, or you can binge them in just a couple of hours. On this episode, we move from diagnosis to activation. If work has been repriced by distrust, skills volatility, and AI, then internal comms can't be a newsroom. It has to be behavior design, working between HR and the C-suite to get people doing the right things in the right sequence with the right energy. For this conversation, I'm joined by Mike Klein, editor-in-chief of our media partner, Strategic Magazine. Mike is a globally recognized expert on internal communications, and we're glad he's joined us. We're also joined by Malcolm O'Neill, Chief Human Resource Officer for the architectural firm The Moore Group, and Peter Lyle, co-founder at Ascent Advisory Services, who works with leadership teams on strategy, value creation, and results. So Mike, we'll start with you. In this age of distrust and work disruption, why is the old communication model now really malpractice?
Well, it's malpractice because it's aligned with a paradigm that no longer exists, but that's still comfortable. So there's this idea that it's the old employee engagement bargain that was sold by Gallup in the early part of the century. The idea that if you increase employee engagement by a certain percent, you'll get more profitability. The idea that trying to juice up engagement was kind of a one-way bet where you put a little bit of money in, you make people feel happy, and it just goes cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. The problem with employee engagement as a paradigm, and the reason why I would agree with you that it's malpractice, is that employee engagement was really a two-way bet. Employees would be willing to contribute discretionary effort, as Gallup would call it, but also contribute their tolerance for organizational inconsistencies and, for lack of a better term, corporate noise in return for and they would contribute their performance in return for security and prosperity. You now have a spate of performance agnostic layoffs rippling through industries, rippling through profitable, successful companies like Nestle, like Apple, like Amazon, like Novo Nordisk, companies that are making money hand over fist. And that's creating a ripple effect throughout industry. You can't just simply expect people to act as if the old social contract works when it's being torn up and spit out.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. Malcolm, from your HR perspective, it's this old broadcast communication model can't change Tuesday. What can? What if we have to go to a behavior design model? What does that mean?
And I think when you think about, what Mike was laying out is it's just not the broadcast or it's not the subject. It's, what are you looking to go from A to B? What are you looking to change? You've got to get to this kind of micro level. And, and a lot of people always start with values, but, your values are more of a constant. They can't change on a dime. And, to use and speaking of changing and movement and fast, let's just use a car analogy. Think about the values on the side of a billboard. If you need that car to go in a different direction, that's the steering wheel. You can't change the billboard to make the car go in a different direction. But if you teach people to turn 2 degrees this way, 3 degrees that way, you can change the trajectory of the car. And that's how you drive change. You have to get out of just like this kind of performance theater that we've been talking about in some earlier sessions and thinking about, well, it's new billboards or repaint the billboard. And then, at least to your point about the behavior change, there is a sequence of how you engineer the adoption. It has its components of the ask of what are we looking to do differently? Like, here's behavior today, but what's the behavior tomorrow? Or what behavior might we looking to retain so that we don't lose it? So you want to solidify it. What's the value exchange? What's the WIFM? What's in it for me? Why are we doing this? And then the journey in small steps. The system, how do you get that system piece to model, coach, and require? And then measures, how will you know what you're delivering against there right there? So, it's not that change isn't a message, it's a set of new defaults. And I think that's what, Mike was really articulating too, is before we thought change was as easy as get them happy and engaged and they'll change into anything. And that's the malpractice that we were talking about there, or the fallacy of that whole model, because the world has evolved and who's to say it really worked when it was first being positioned?
No, that's an excellent point, Malcolm. I mean, it and I don't want to belabor the whole social contract piece, because what we're really talking about is how do we drive performance inside of a new social contract. And without talking about what that social contract looks like, we got to look at, okay, where can internal communication tangibly, incredibly improve performance? The key point, and values are part of it, because you're talking about, and ultimately you're talking about guardrails. So one of the other things that's happening at the moment is that AI is accelerating the pace, not just through which work is flowing, but through which decisions need to be made. And so, in order to make consistent, effective decisions, people need to know what the criteria are. And that's kind of what you're talking about when you're moving away from broadcast, moving away from billboards, telling people, to move the steering wheel 3 degrees. Ultimately, you want to have in that dashboard a pointer that says steer here, or at least a range of which the steering is acceptable, so that people know to steer within that range, or at least to make a conscious decision to steer beyond that range, rather than just simply do it by default. I think what we're really talking about here is a point where we're converging internal comms, decision-making infrastructure, and behavioral change together.
The classic cliche that I usually start with is values enable you to make decisions when nobody's looking. And then I reference a well-known British banker who used to use that same phrase quite regularly for his staff, until it turned out that he was in charge of a fraudulent enterprise and people were looking and they happened to be the police. So hypocrisy can play a role in this as well. But fundamentally, if you have a set of values that are designed to drive decision making when nobody is looking, that is a good thing. But there has to be evidence that the leadership, in whatever form, is walking the talk. It's as simple as that. It's not just an internal comms thing. It's a leadership and behavioral thing. And putting some nice pictures of honesty or integrity or whatever it is, pictures of Colorado on the people's walls, as we well know, is not going to make a difference, is it? So
It's interesting. Go ahead.
Carry on, Elise. Yeah.
I would say I was working with a client 10 or 12 years ago at this point, and we were trying to drive change in the organization and help the organization realize that in this case, it was a university, and that there were expenditures that drove the academic mission of the university, and then there was expenditures where, yes, you've got to have back office operations, but those are not delivering on the mission. And so we were trying to drive this notion of let's spend very cognizantly and very carefully in these back office functions so that we can invest in the frontline mission of the university. And one of the things that we did in that was we took everyone's printers, personal printers, off their desks. And you could no longer expense reimbursement requests for paper and ink. And we put in common area printers that everyone could use. And while this was by no means the largest way that this client was going to save money, it was a very physical act of people had to now walk to the printer. And it was that daily small reminder that the values are changing and we need to be really investing in the frontline mission of the organization. So I think it's small changes like that that can really drive the point home around on the change you're trying to make. All right. So, Peter, I'm sure that you've seen some of these behavior design concepts in your work with clients. Can you share an example of a dilemma that makes a culture more actionable?
Yeah, when I first started working in ancillary businesses next to the oil and gas industry, I really had no idea prior to that how important safety was. And like most consumers, I just thought that petrol, as we call it, gas, as you call it, came from a petrol station or a gas station. I had no concept of what happened before that, upstream, midstream, downstream. And the very first client meeting I went to was with regional output of Chevron. And I did 4 things wrong within about a minute and a half. I parked my car the wrong way round, so I went nose in instead of tail in. I went up an escalator, not holding the rail, because I had a coffee in one hand and a mobile phone in the other. I also managed to drop the coffee on myself, a hot liquid. So I wasn't holding the rail, dropped the coffee, couldn't park properly, and I was speaking on the phone. And this very polite but very direct senior individual let me get to the top of the escalator, took me to one side and said, "Do you realize why we take safety so seriously?" And what he called on the beach, which was onshore as opposed to offshore, on the beach. He said, "So that idiots like you get the message so that when people go offshore, they behave in a safe way." And so it was a really salutary lesson. And so in terms of the point obviously trying to make, there was a mandate on high, we will be a safe organization. Great. That means very little until you actually see it in action, which is somebody, he didn't care who I was, but his job was to protect the safety of workers and indeed to protect me from myself. And that, I think, was a great example of somebody willing to intervene when many of us would have just let the incident go by. And that says a lot about that organization, which felt it had empowered its people to live by the values and not just see them as some sort of token gesture. People were willing to intervene, and by the same token, people were willing to take guidance and advice. So I learned that it wasn't a particularly hard way, but it was a very memorable way. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what's really great about what Peter just shared is the previous topic. That is behavior design at the micro level in those small steps. You know, the rear entry or the backing into the parking spot, 2 points of contact, or 1 point of contact on the stairwell, and that whole concept of being able to then, that becomes the default, the norm there. And what's really exciting is when organizations have that default set, whether it was a senior leader at the top of the stairs or the lowest admin, they all would have found Peter and made that same comment.
Yeah.
And that's when you've got something that, Mike, to your point, tying it all back into driving the car, that's something where you know exactly where the car is going and everything. There was nothing on the wall that told them what to do to say, find Peter. They were, culturally attuned to being a safe organization, but had the skill set of the change model, the behavior design to go and execute against that. And then I'll take it one step further. Have worked in one of those organizations before, and one of the best stories that I've ever heard about how well this translates of behavior design is one of the leaders talked about how when he sent his daughters off to school and they were at university, they were known as Handrail Sally. Sally was their name, but when they would be carrying their laundry up the stairs or carrying their suitcases, she was the one at university making them put one of them down and hold one part of the handrail is they would go up and down the dorms and everything like that. So when you get behavior design that well, it translates into the family. That's how change. That's the change curve right there that we're talking about.
Um, I think picking up on this, it is minor actions, which I think it would be easy to look at the org chart and say we're going to start with the C-suite and work ourselves our way down. Does the org chart actually matter when you're trying to drive change, or is there a different way we should think about employee segments?
I think you're spot on. I mean, it's so easy just to start at the top and say, if I get the top right, everything else will cascade down. And we know that there's so many failure modes when you do it that way, because you've got to have it perfectly all the way to get down there to that coal face where you've got the force multipliers that talk to the masses and everything, and just how many times that chain can break. So when you then start to think about, like, okay, well, who are the change makers? Who are the change blockers? It's who's got influence. So it's not always seniority, and it's not always the top of the org chart. Managers, first line leaders, people supervisors, those are your force multipliers right there, because that's where you really do get that piece. You've got your doers, your frontline workforce as well. Also critical roles, the ones that, whether it's, scarce skills and everything, and also new joiners. New joiners are, your new hires are such a great piece. We always talk about, kind of more in a medical term, the concept of a herd effect. If I inoculate with this vaccine, the herd effect can eradicate something. That is also so true as a change management philosophy, in terms of, if you can get 10 or 15%, and early adopters can always usually be early joiners, to get and adopt something, you can really drive that. So going back, if you think about the org chart, as just where a seating chart. It's where everyone fits inside the organization, but it's these behavior segments. Those are the players on the field, and games are won by players, not by your seating chart and everything. So
It's also important to note, I mean, you were talking about the early adopters, and you were talking about new starters. There's an underlying dynamic behind this, which is called the 3% rule. I call it the 3 to 5% rule. The 3% of people drive 90% of the conversations in an organization, and most of those people are not visible as such on the org chart.
right.
There's a whole technology called organizational network analysis, which is designed and is very successful at surfacing who these people are and mapping them out within the organization so that they can be accessible. And and I'm mentioning that not just because I love organizational network analysis and think that everybody should do it, but it's once you've recognized that that's possible, the whole relationship with the org chart changes. And it also gets back to the whole messaging around where the guardrails are. I mean, one thing that we haven't talked about today is prioritization, which is, I would say at least as critical as values, in terms of not only knowing who we are, but also knowing what's important now for us to deliver for the quarter, for the year, for the near term. And by bringing those distinctions to the right people, and making sure that those people who are focused on priority A know how important priority B is, not to interfere with priority B while delivering on priority A. So that's where internal communication really will come into focus as we move to this new paradigm, is in giving people the understanding of how things fit together, as well as what you need to do in your own particular role at any time.
Peter, I think part of this gets to, we're asking employees to make a change. We're asking managers to operate differently on a day-to-day basis. What's the plain English value proposition for them? Why would an employee or manager make a change?
Well, there was a time when they didn't have a choice. You will make a change, or hey, there's the door. It's a balancing act now in terms of value exchange. The traditional situation of either you're told what you do or you get fired, or your loyalty is expected. So many factors have driven a horse and cart through that. So, and it's not easy for managers. It's not that they have to balance. People are shouting at them from them above, and there are people shouting at them from below. And so, the balance that is required between saying, okay, as a human being, I'm going to treat you fairly, but I'm not expecting too much from you, because I know it's a contract at the end of the day, and we'll smile and we'll be friendly to each other, and we'll be polite. But I know that you're selling you me your labor, and I'm taking advantage of that. And I think that's a very important thing. I always used to know when people were resigning from my organization because they'd unprompted, there'd be nothing in the diary. They'd knock on my door and come in and say, Peter, can I talk to you about something? And it would always start with an apology, which is, I'm afraid, I'm sorry to say, I'd like to resign. I'm going to resign. And I said, well, A, you don't have to apologize because it's entirely up to you what you do. And B, I have no expectations of loyalty from you whatsoever. We get on fine. You do a good job. I'd love you to stay. Or sometimes actually I was quite keen for them to resign. I'm glad they did. But the basic bit that an answer to your question, Elise, is the concept of balance. And I would think that precious few middle managers get any training or advice or guidance on how to do that. And if Malcolm has a role to play in the senior roles that he has had, I'm sure this is one thing that they focus on. You know, a middle manager is representative both of the employee and of the organization, and boy, is that a difficult thing to do.
Yeah, I think it's like well said, Peter. I mean, it's almost more like it's the right answer to really keep someone sub-optimized and maintain them for 5 years longer than they should be there, or helping them understand what their tour of duty is. So imagine the day that instead of saying, I'm sorry to share, I'm excited to share, I'm signed up for my next tour of duty. And when then what's the win-win is that the next tour of duty is with current said company. But if it is at the next company, you've retained them for the period that you needed them when you were going from A to B or the team was being built out. But it is a piece too where we actually know when you have to start with the apology that we've never lived up to the initial value proposition and everything versus them actually being able to say, I came here to get X, you helped me get to Y, and I'm excited to share them at Y now, and I'm going to Z and everything. So
All been in organizations where there's change resistance or even change failure.
yeah.
What breaks the change adoption? Is it the change proposition, the sequencing of it, the management, reinforcement? What causes the failure?
Yeah, I think it's definitely sequencing, no, without a doubt. And, it's even like, I would say it's like the whole concept of that management layer right there that we were talking about, that middle management piece that might not have all the parts and pieces of it. I always say too, a classic failure is when an employee finds out about a change before a manager knows. And so that's all of a sudden you start at this deficit because, hey, boss, I just got this email, got this in the mail, heard this in the town hall. What's that about? I don't know. First time I've heard it. That right there, all of a sudden puts you at a deficit, which was more than likely probably a positive change to unlock value of why something was happening or to correct an issue. But that cascading of being able to embed it and have the right, prep for that manager so that they can say, I don't know about it. I was briefed yesterday. We're getting the next step here. That's that sequencing type piece that really, if you can get that right, that's 80% there. You really start to get so much more value there so that you don't get a middle manager caught off guard in that, what I call no surprise comms and everything. So,
Although that's incredibly difficult in this environment because where certainly in public companies where there are strict rules that say that you have to communicate externally before you communicate internally, that at best many managers are getting the information at the same time as their employees,
right.
which neuters their authority presence substantially. And that's just something that organizations, publicly listed organizations have to live with. But I want to come back to Peter's point about the extent to which managers are prepared to act conducively in these environments. Managers are under unprecedented pressure in in the environment in which we're talking about, because not only are they becoming more central, you've got with the layoffs that we were talking about in large companies, you've got delayering of managers, you've got an increase of spans of control, and you have an escalating number of decisions that are being made as work becomes easier to do. And so the pressure that managers are under, knowing that they may be next, is something that needs to be accounted for. You can't just simply add. You can't. I mean, you've got to minimize the pressure from a communication perspective on managers, because communication isn't the only thing they have to do, and they may not feel appropriately incentivized to do it the way the organization wants them to do it.
Or indeed competent to do it. Mike, I'm sure that's a critical part of it as well.
Oh, that much as well, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, Mike, let's tie together some of the themes from our conversation. If you could, go talk to an executive team and say something about employee communications this quarter, what would you tell them?
The main thing I would say is you need to watch the extent to which AI isn't just automating work, but that it's accelerating it. And that's going to put pressure on managers, it's going to put pressure on leaders, it's going to require employees much more guidance in terms of how to make consistent decisions and how to drive what the organization's agenda is without having to come up with the answers on their own. Because the more decisions are distributed, the more space for inconsistency there is. And that's reputational risk, that's operational risk, that's durational risk in terms of employees, being willing to stay in an organization that exposes them that way. And it's also an opportunity to get ahead of the organizations that you're competing with, because they're dealing with this stuff and they may not recognize it as quickly as you do.
I think if I was answering that question, Elise, and again, apologies for people that have heard me say this before, communication actually comes from the Latin communicare, which means to share. It doesn't come from the Latin communicare meaning to tell or to shout. And if you want to be a good messenger, you need to be a good listener. And maybe that's where I would encourage managers of all types, and Mike's right, the pressures are intense, but if you can listen, interpret, understand, synthesize, and then say something pertinent, what you say is far more likely to land rather than you just reading from a script that you've been given from somebody on high, which we all know is probably less effective.
Yeah, I would just end and underscore what Mike talked about, the initiative overload. Always that exec call, and whether it's a one-on-one or even the exec team, asking the exec team to say, what are the top 3 priorities for this quarter? And you'd be amazed about how much disparity you would see across that team. If everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. And so that's that clarity piece of being able to do that. And then, like you said, you go down Peter's approach of then saying, okay, I'm going to share, but I'm also listening back, so that does that cascade down and everything like that? And it's a simple test to say, every 90 days, if there's a pulse, to say, what are the top 3 priorities? And the top 3 priorities could be the same all year. That would be great. That would be a static condition, but more than likely they will change every quarter.
Right. Well, I think that's an excellent way to tie up our conversation today. So thanks to the 3 of you. That's this episode of The Talent Ledger. And the takeaway is simple. Internal comms is not a newsroom anymore. It's behavior change. If you want the full context, the 4-part article series is available via our Talent Ledger landing page or through our media partner, Strategic Magazine. The link is in the first comment on this video or podcast post. If this was useful, please like the episode and drop us a comment with the question you're wrestling with right now. Which of the 3 forces is doing the most damage in your organization? Where are the biggest policy theater distractions? We read your comments and we will use them to shape what we cover next.